Hello, Gatsbyverse. I'm John Vajda, Senior Product Manager of Developer Enablement at New Relic. I'm really excited to be speaking at GatsbyConf, talking about how New Relic built our developer and documentation sites on Gatsby. Anyone who has used Gatsby knows how awesome of a technology it is. And the Jamstack was exactly what we were looking for to meet the challenges we face in this huge undertaking. A little bit about me. My mission is to empower makers and creators to build amazing things that will change the world. Focusing on developer enablement and developer experience at New Relic has allowed me to do just that. But what is New Relic? New Relic 1 is an observability platform built to help engineers create more perfect software. You can instrument everything, then analyze, troubleshoot, and optimize your entire software stack. So let's talk about how we use Gatsby. We had 3 different sites to consider, all with different use cases. We had over 8,000 Markdown files of content to work with, and significant site traffic to consider, 700,000 page views a month and 325,000 sessions a month. We also needed to deploy 30 micro contents updates a day. And we wanted to do this with one global theme, as well as a global component library, so that all sites can easily leverage those things. A pleasant surprise recently where we found that a company that New Relic acquired called Pixie actually used Gatsby as well for 3 other sites. And Pixie is really cool if you're an application developer working on Kubernetes. So I highly recommend you check it out. So we set out to define this project. We had several key requirements that were must-haves, and Gatsby checked the box on all of these. One was simplification. We wanted a single source of content to feed multiple sites. The other is syndication. Multiple output formats are really important to us. We needed JSON, RSS, and even we needed to convert MDX to HTML. Since we're an open source community, contributions was another priority. However, we didn't want to use a CMS. We wanted to use just to get workflows and let users contribute through standard development flows. We also wanted to support low coders, so MDX was a great solution for that. So people can contribute small updates to the site and also make modifications in a really simple and easy thing to use. Transparency is really critical in open source, so that was another key priority. And finally, we had aggressive plans to expand to multiple countries, so the support of languages through localization was also a critical requirement for us. One of the greatest strengths of Gatsby is its developer community, and especially its plugin ecosystem. My team has an inside joke that anytime you face a tough problem, there must be a plugin for that. However, there are times where you just have to build your own custom Gatsby plugins. So now I'm going to hand it off to my counterpart, Jerel Miller, who's going to talk to you more about the custom plugins that New Relic built. And I thank you for your time. Take it away, Jerel.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. I'm Jerel Miller, Senior Software Engineer at New Relic. I'm going to be talking to you today about building custom Gatsby plugins and how we use them at New Relic. We're going to take a look at why you might want to build your own. Then we're going to actually implement 2 of them together using source code from 2 of New Relic's custom plugins. And finally, we'll take a look at some use cases New Relic has for our custom plugins on 2 of our sites. So let's dive in. Why might you want to build your own? Something that became pretty obvious to us out of the gate is how well they lend themselves to execute on unique requirements. So let's take this example. Here's a requirement we had early on in our doc site. Now, I don't expect you to fully understand what this means, so let me summarize this for you. Let's say I'm a user and I visit a page at this URL. And I go to my address bar and delete part of the URL to get to a page at this URL. If we don't already have an authored page at this URL, we want to automatically generate a page that looks like this. You can see we've got some links grouped together by some headings. By moving this into a custom plugin, this really helps us kind of focus this logic and put it in a single area, which lends us to the next point, which is that it helps us adhere to the single responsibility principle. So we're going to take a look at the source code that executes on this requirement. You can see it's pretty long. In fact, it's 219 lines of code, and it operates on a single Gatsby API, the Create Pages API. Now, this is just the logic for creating these automatically generated index pages. This doesn't include any of our other Create Pages logic. So you can imagine 219 lines of code. If we had this in our root Gatsby node file, how quickly this could become entangled with our other logic. By extracting it to a custom plugin, it helps us really focus this. It helps with long-term maintainability, because now we have one area that focuses on this particular behavior. Now let's take a look at another requirement. Custom Gatsby plugins really help us with reusability. So here's another set of requirements we had for our doc site. We want a JSON endpoint for what's new IDs, and a JSON endpoint for what's new content. Now I don't expect you to fully understand what what's new is, but the point I want you to see here is that we've got a common thread, and that's that we want two JSON endpoints. Here's a look at our Gatsby config. You'll notice we've got our plugin, gatsby-plugin-generate-json, listed twice. Once for the IDs, and once for the content. By moving this into a custom plugin, we're able to reuse this logic, which means that we can spin up new JSON endpoints pretty easily. Now we're going to actually implement this plugin together. Let's go ahead and take a look at implementing two of New Relic's custom plugins together. But before we begin, I want to point out something. And that's if you know how to develop in your project's Gatsby files, you know how to build a custom plugin. There's really only one minor difference. And that's that plugins take options. So in order to get access to those options, you just have to use the second argument passed to any of the Gatsby APIs in the Gatsby files. So with that in mind, let's get started and actually develop gatsby-plugin-generate-json together. Let's take a look at what our config should look like so that we understand the options that we want support for. So this is what we have. We're going to want a path option to specify where this endpoint is going to live. We want a query, optional query, in case we want to get data out of GraphQL, and a serialize function that takes the raw data and formats it for our JSON endpoint. So let's go ahead and build this. First, we're going to create our plugin in the plugins folder. Then we're going to create a package.json file with really nothing in it except for an empty object, and our Gatsby node file. We're going to work within the onPost build API provided by Gatsby. I'm going to pull off a couple helpers from Gatsby, the GraphQL and the store, and get access to my plugin options. Let's go and destructure some variables off of these, and get our result from GraphQL by calling the GraphQL function with a query provided via plugin options. Once we have our result, we're going to want to ask the serialize function for access to the formatted data using that result from the query. Once we have our formatted data, we're going to want to write this to the file system. So I'm going to bring in the path helper and declare a file path variable. We're going to write this JSON file to our public folder so that it's a publicly accessible endpoint. Because we're working with the file system, we're going to want to make sure the directory at this endpoint exists so that we don't run into any errors. So I'm going to bring in the fs utility and then create the directory for this API endpoint, if it doesn't already exist. Once that's done, let's go ahead and write the file. Now note this implementation assumes that we have a query option. Let's say we have some static data that we also want to create a JSON endpoint for. We're going to make one minor tweak to this. Check to see if we have a query, and if so, pass the result of the GraphQL query to our serialize function, and if not, we'll just pass through some null data. And just like that, we've got ourselves a reusable plugin that we can use to create JSON endpoints. This is pretty awesome. It really didn't require that much code. Let's take a look at one more example, gatsby-remark-custom-heading-ids. To understand what this plugin is going to do, let's take a look at what we're trying to accomplish here. So here I've got some markdown, a heading with a text of hello world, and I want a custom ID for this heading of hello. Now for those that have worked with Gatsby remark autolink headers, you may be asking yourself, why do we need this? Especially since that plugin provides a custom ID option. The answer may be a little bit unique to us, but we're working with an alpha version of MDX v2, and unfortunately Gatsby remark autolink headers is incompatible. Autolink headers expects a syntax that looks like this. Some of the parsing rules have changed in MDX v2, and unfortunately this results in a syntax error. So with that out of the way, what should our config look like? In this case, we're going to make it a little bit more simple. Inside of Gatsby plugin MDX, we're going to provide this as an option to Gatsby remark plugins. Now notice we're using require.resolve syntax here. If you're curious why, I'd encourage you to check out the issue listed here. Let's go ahead and dive in and build this. So I'm going to create my plugin, create my package.json file, and create an index.js file. I'm going to create a default export and destructure the markdown AST from the first argument. Now, because we didn't provide any options to this plugin, I'm going to ignore the second argument to this. When you're working with Markdown ASTs, especially Remark, you'll be working with a set of utilities provided by Unified.js. We're going to go ahead and bring in one now, unist-util-visit. So let's go ahead and install it. This is going to allow us to traverse the AST so that we can make modifications to it. Now that we've got that installed, let's go ahead and import it and provide a visitor. Notice we declare an is heading with custom ID helper function. This will allow us to make sure we're only visiting nodes that are headings with a custom ID. We're going to match against a pattern to ensure that we're only working with custom IDs. And with that declared, let's go and implement is heading with custom ID. You'll see we only want to visit nodes that are type heading, that we have a last child that is a link reference, and that link reference's label property matches as our custom ID pattern. We're going to tuck this away in a helper file just to make it a little easier to work with this file here. Once we have this declared, we need to grab the ID off of the node. So let's go ahead and declare a getID helper and take the result of that and assign it to an ID variable. Let's go ahead and implement getID, which is just going to take the last child of the heading node, check the label property on that link reference, and replace the pound sign. That way we have a nice clean value to work with. Again, let's go ahead and tuck that into a utility file just to make this a little more concise. We're going to set data on our node for that ID so that when this compiles to HTML, we get our custom ID that we expect. And sure enough, if we inspect the HTML after this change, you'll notice we've got a heading with a custom ID of hello and our text hello world. This is pretty awesome. With just a few lines of code, we're able to get some pretty powerful functionality. But you'll note here pretty quickly that we've got one problem, and that's that our custom ID text still shows up in our header. Let's go ahead and fix that. We're going to bring in another library, unist-util-remove, to go ahead and help us remove this from our heading node. Let's go ahead and install it. And with that, we're going to import it and remove that link reference. And just with that minor tweak, if we inspect the HTML, we get something that looks like this. This is pretty great. We've got our custom ID and we get the text that we expect. Now, for those of us that have worked with Gatsby Remark Auto-Link headers, that plugin provides some really great functionality. We may want to continue to use that. So we want to update this plugin to make sure it can work with that plugin as well. But we need to do one more thing to make sure that that happens. If we use this with Gatsby Remark Auto-Link headers, you'll note HTML that looks kind of like this. You'll see we have an anchor tag that gets added inside of our header. You'll note one problem right away. That's that the ID and the href property are mismatched. The href property should reflect the custom ID that we have, but unfortunately it does not. So let's go ahead and patch this. Now the implementation is going to assume a couple things, namely that the anchor tag is the first child in the heading node and that it's got a class of anchor. These are the default options for Gatsby Remark Auto-Link headers. If you wanted to extend this to allow that to be more flexible, you can absolutely provide options to this. But for the purposes of this, we're going to assume that it's always the first child. So let's go ahead and grab a reference to that first child. We're going to just double check that it is in fact a link and that it's got the class of anchor to ensure we're working with what we expect. And once that's done, we're going to go ahead and patch that URL with our custom ID. Let's go ahead and add a comment for other developers so that they understand what this piece of code does for us. And with that change, if we inspect the HTML, this is what we get. This is pretty awesome. We've got our custom ID and we've got our href property generated from Gatsby Remark Auto-Link headers reflecting our custom ID. We did it. This is pretty cool. Again, you can see it's pretty simple to implement custom plugins yourself, and sometimes really doesn't require that much code. So with that, let's take a look at some of the other use cases we have at New Relic for custom plugins. Here's a list of all the plugins we have on our doc site and our developer site. We have a mix of generic plugins, which handle everything from automatically generating index pages for all directories, which we talked about earlier. We have 2 plugins for generating JSON endpoints, one of which we implemented together. We have a plugin for generating RSS feeds for our release notes. We have some Remark plugins that handle everything from MDX v2 compatibility issues to our custom heading IDs, which we implemented together earlier. We have a couple for asset sizing and one for removing inner paragraphs from our button component. We have some source plugins that source data into our GraphQL layer. that include sourcing event and attribute definitions, our navigation hierarchy for every page, our New Relic 1 SDK documentation, and a plugin that takes data from a search engine to automatically generate related resources for every page. I highly encourage you to take a look at opensource.newrelic.com, developer.newrelic.com, and docs.newrelic.com, which we just relaunched yesterday as a Gatsby site. These are all open source. I encourage you to go take a look at the source code to check out implementations of some of the other custom plugins. If you have ideas on how to improve them, we'd love your contributions. In fact, we're opening up a contributor contest for 2 weeks. We have some issues labeled with a GatsbyConf hashtag that you can get started with. Or if you have an idea for your own enhancement, we'd love that too. We have a thank you gift for everyone that participates, and a New Relic prize bag for the best contribution, which will be selected by the team. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening to us today. We appreciate your time.